All right, everybody. Well, welcome. I think there will be a few more people hopefully trickling in, but I'm glad that you all are here and made it. This is our second series of our series of 7. As we studied last time, Why Should I Believe in God? We went through what's called the cosmological argument and also the teleological arguments, which are basically around the universe and how perfect it is for us. And then tonight we're going to be looking more at the God of the Bible and can we trust the Bible? And then we're going to go through a few other series. So this Saturday will be Is There Evidence for Jesus? So tonight it's kind of the Bible as a whole. And then on Saturday we're going to be looking specifically at Jesus as a historical figure as well as a biblical figure. And then the 20th we're going to be looking at Is there a problem with evil? So basically looking at morality and how we define that and how we are kind of a part of that now in Christianity. And then can we trust science? What happens when we die? Am I good enough? And is there only one truth or only one way to God? So exciting series as we continue. And then, so I do want to start tonight just with a little Q&A. I know not everybody was there from last time, but if anybody had any questions from the last series, I know it was a little bit deep. It was kind of sciencey, so it wasn't everybody's cup of tea. But tonight will be a little bit different focus. But if not, I have a few questions I'll kind of throw out there as well. So don't everybody jump up at once. But great. All right, so one of the first questions I got was, do you believe in the Big Bang? So I talked about last time how with the cosmological theory that this idea that the universe had a beginning, therefore because it had a beginning, then that means that there was a cause or there was an explanation for it, that God came and made it into existence. And then I talked about the evidence around the Big Bang. So my answer is yes, no, in a way. So what science can do is it can explain what we can observe now. And science is not actually really designed to look at what happened in the past. We can make inferences and assumptions. So a good example for me when I'm looking at the Big Bang, well, first off, if I was a pure materialist, that means that everything that is. Like there's no supernatural, okay? There's no God, there's no anything. Then I would trust the science and I would say that there is the Big Bang. The thing for me, as I believe in creation and that God was the creator, I think that if you believe that Adam and Eve were created, I don't think he created them as babies. And I think that the same thing is true when you look at the universe. You can create it, he can create however he wants. He can make it look like whatever age he wants. And I think just like we learned with some of those fine-tuning things, you can't start out with a zero universe. You kind of have to have things in place. So I do think that there was a Big Bang. Was it, 13.6 billion years ago? I don't know, and I can't know that based on science, but I think the science does point to a beginning of the universe. Was that beginning at the Big Bang, or was it God said it and there was a bang? I don't know. So I think the point still for me is that the universe began, and because of that, there had to be something that is supernatural outside of this natural world. Hopefully that makes sense. And the other thought is, could belief in God be this kind of psychological coping rather than the truth? So this actually goes for both sides of the argument. Atheists can actually make the same claim, because some atheists don't want to feel guilty. And if there is no God, if there is no justice at the end of time, then it makes me feel better. I can cope with society, I can cope with life. I stole something, but who cares? Nobody knows about it. I don't need to feel guilty because there's no overarching God that's going to punish me, so who cares? So it doesn't really go either way. It doesn't help you in either being an atheist or a Christian, but it doesn't affect the truth. So the same thing, if I said, food is good for me. Is that just me, psychologically, helping my hunger go away? Partially, especially if I'm eating cookies or something. There's probably this psychological aspect, but At the same time, food is good for me. So it doesn't change what the truth is based on how I feel about it. And so that's what we're really trying to explore in the series, is what is the truth? That's why the title is What Should I Believe? Because we're looking for what is truth. Then the third question is, why I think the designer of this universe is the God of the Bible. So we kind of hinted at that a little bit at the end of last series, but basically when you have kind of three ideas, you have that atheist, that there is no God, the agnostic, which isn't sure if there is a God or not, or claims you can't know if there's a God, and then there's the third part, which is the theist. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the God is the God of the Christian God, but I think that based on what we talked about last time, some good arguments support that God is reasonable. And why the God of the Bible? I think because it matches up with those ideas that we talked about, that the God is a personal God because he designed this universe perfectly for us. He's eternal because you have to be outside of this universe, something outside of time, space, and matter. And that's the way God in the Bible is described. He's a creator who's all-powerful. So there's a lot of different theist views out there. There's lots of small gods or demigods or multiple gods that can do different things. And those also haven't been shown to be they don't last, those theories. So like Greek gods and Roman gods, like nobody really worships those anymore. We use them in, fun, comics and things like that, but nobody really is like, oh, I still believe in Zeus. Not that I know of, maybe there's some group out there, but. So, I think as we also just dive into the Bible tonight, we'll kind of see why I think the Bible is the best religious book that has the best evidence behind it, and I think that also helps support why I think God of the Bible is the true God of the theist view. So, any other questions? No? Okay. Sounds good. Well, we'll jump in to can we trust the Bible? So, can we trust the Bible? There's really three options as we get into this, as we study the Bible. So, one is yes, we can trust it. And then there's no. That's also the other option. But then there's also partially. So, if you actually look at a number of different religions out there in the world, the three answers that you see across. So us as Christians, we say, yes, the Bible is trustworthy. Then there's other people, let's say Hindu, say, no, it's not really that accurate. It doesn't really matter. Or Sikhs, or somebody that's like in a totally different faith. Or there's the partiality. So people that are actually Muslims, they actually believe that the Bible is partially true, or even Jehovah's Witness, they say that there's some truth in the Bible, but it's been kind of twisted and manipulated, and it's been false over time. So this is a question for you all in the audience, so I just gave you a hint of one of them. But what are some complaints that you have heard about the Bible about not being reliable? Yes.
I've heard people are unsure of its reliability because it's been translated so many times, and it's so old and it's gone through so many different hands and it's got so many different writers. How can it be all one truth?
Yeah. So that's a great way of laying it out there. It has been translated. It's very old, and it's gone through many, many, many people's hands over the last several thousand years. Yeah.
There are some apparent contradictions.
Apparent contradictions, yes. Very true. There's some apparent contradictions. And we'll get into some of those tonight, as well as the other topic. Anything else? So another one would be historically inaccurate. So that's also been something that's been thrown out there. So you guys are right on track. So there's three, if you guys look at your little sheets. I tried to make things in red due to my wife's feedback after last presentation to try to help. I might have missed a couple, so I apologize. But one is that historically trustworthiness. So that's what we're really looking for as we look at the scriptures. So if I said, Daniel, the lion's den was, in Babylon, you're like, okay, we can look through some of those facts. But what if I said it was in Jamaica? You'd be like, well, Jamaica didn't even exist then, and so it didn't really make sense. So those are some things that we need to check out. Like, are all the places in the Bible that we're talking about real, and do they really exist? Is it textually trustworthy, or is it transmission? So what you brought up, where is what we have now the same as what was in the past? Like, has it changed over the time frame? So textual. And then there's canonical. So this is doxological trustworthiness. So are the books that are in the Bible the books that should be in the Bible? So are there other books that we maybe should include in there, or are there other books that we have in the Bible that maybe we should kick out? Like, they're not trustworthy after all. So we're going to look at several of these things and a few other things. I did want to give you one of the references that I use for this talk. If you've ever heard of Wesley Huff, he has a great website online, and he has one that says, "Is the Bible True? A Full Talk." He actually has a kind of like a podcast series that he goes through as well, and he goes to Israel and a few other places in the Middle East and walks through several of these points that we're going to talk about today. And I will even quote him several times, and I did use several of his slides, so I will say that now as we get into that, so I don't technically plagiarize, but I did. So great resource. He actually wants you to use his stuff, so he's a great resource. So with that, we're going to do some historical evidence first. So a lot of these things are actually really interesting to me, because as I was studying it, the archaeological evidence for many people in the Bible was thought to be false. They said, we couldn't find anything about King David. He's this massive figure in the Bible, but all these people were just in the Bible. And so looking at the Bible, this is called the Tel Dan inscription. It was a 19th century BC. So this is a long time ago, not 18th, 9th century, I think I did 19th. So it's in Aramaic, and it's hard to see in the quality of the picture, but there's an inscriptions on here, and it has the first extra-biblical evidence of King David, for it's actually mentioning specifically the house of David. And a lot of these things are actually due to battles. Like, people like to keep track of the battles that they won, if you can imagine. And interestingly enough, there's actually several battles that people came back from, and they said they won, but they didn't. But then they can just say, "Hey, I'm this great king because I won this battle," and it's like, well, not quite. But so David was a true figure based on this. Then in Isaiah, so Isaiah 20, 1 through 20, it says, in the year that the supreme commander sent Sargon, king of Assyria, came to Ashdod and attacked and captured it. And he reigned in about 700 to 705 BC. And this person was, for a long time, just thought as, again, a historical figure or just a made-up figure in the Bible. However, in Iran, just a few years ago, they actually found his capital, which, interestingly enough, his son, which is called Sennacherib, is also mentioned in the Bible, and he moved his capital, which was Sargon's capital, to the city of Nineveh. If you've ever heard of Nineveh and Jonah, so this was the Assyrian capital for a while as well. And again, Nineveh was also thought to be this kind of mythical place, and as more archaeology has continued to find more and more places, they did find Nineveh as well, and there's inscriptions and different information that they can find out there, which is pretty amazing. So I mentioned Sennacherib. So Sennacherib, as you can see, these people made these really amazing things that last a really long time. So we have these tablets, and they didn't like to just use a tablet. When you think about it's just like a sheet of paper that they wrote on, just it was stone instead. But they did these kind of columns and prism type things. So all these different stories that you could kind of read through. And the nice thing is that they preserve really well because they are written in stone. And so this was actually from this prism, Taylor's prism that they found. And to kind of compare what's written there to the Bible. And so in 2 Kings, it mentions that there's the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all fortified cities of Judah and captured them. So Hezekiah, the king of Judah, sent a message to the king of Assyria at Lachish, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. I will pay whatever you demand of me. And then the Taylor's Prism says, as for the king of Judah, Hezekiah, who had not submitted to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, along with the smaller towns taken to battle and battered rams. As for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in a royal city of Jerusalem. So it's pretty amazing that these people are actually writing back and forth. I mean, you can see that in 2 Kings, it's talking about specifically Hezekiah in this battle with Sennacherib, and that prism is actually due from the Battle of Lachish. And Lachish was the second most prominent city in Israel, next to Jerusalem. And there's actually, of the Sennacherib, the prism is part of it, but they actually had this huge mural of stone carvings that was actually the Battle of Lachish. And it was Israel versus Sennacherib. So again, just another instance where the Bible is consistent with history. Then to kind of jump into the New Testament, there is Pontius Pilate. So again, many people for years thought that Pilate was potentially this kind of made-up figure. There was some mention of him in another writing. So there's a historian called Tacitus that said that Pilate, the co-regent of Judea, but then this inscription actually says that he was the governor of Judea. And why is that important? It's actually because in Luke 3, he actually is called the governor by Luke. And so Luke was actually a more accurate historian than Tacitus, because Tacitus was calling him the co-regent, which is a different title. So if I said like, oh, you're the duke, and actually you're not, it's like that doesn't make any sense. So, this was actually again discovered in 1961 to kind of verify that Pontius Pilate was a real person and a governor over in the time of Israel. So Luke is actually this amazing historian. I myself am a doctor. Luke was a doctor, so I feel like we have this close bond already. And Luke, he actually does not go shy about calling people by name. He calls lots of people out by their name, 117 people. And he also lists 114 towns, provinces, islands, seas, and other identifiable places. 25 political, military, social, religious events known to history. Specifically in Acts 11, he talks about there's a famine, and then Acts 18, there's an expulsion of the Jews from the Romans, which also helps us to kind of date some of these writings, because we can say, because actually he doesn't mention it in Luke, but then he mentions it in Acts, and so then it's like, well, Luke was before Acts because these events haven't happened yet, and then in Acts, he's writing a lot of these things. Hebrew doesn't really have perfectly a tense, like we do, like past, present, and future. It's written differently, but it's more written for like it's happening now or happened recently. So I highlight this because let's say if you were an author and you said, I want to come up with this artificial man named Jesus, and he's not real, but he's going to be this person that's going to come about, and I want him to form this new religion. Well, I'm not going to probably name a lot of people, and I'm not going to name a lot of places, because then you can verify my information, like at the same time. And Luke was not hesitant at all. And he actually, as he's writing the book, he's saying to the people that he's writing it to, check me out. Like, look at what I've written, and if I've done something wrong, let me know. And it's kind of the context that he's writing. And he does a great job. And so there's a quick example. So in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, 1 through 3, it says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being the governor of Judea, Herod being the tetrarch of Galilee, the brother of Philip, the tetrarch of the region of Iturea, and then there's his other names, kind of go down here. So all of these things, even in just a couple of verses, he's narrowing it down to a few really prominent people. So he starts out really big and then kind of narrows it down. And again, if you were trying to like fake something, you're not going to be giving you all these information. And so he's really, giving you the time and the place, and really helping you to kind of identify what's been happening. And then the nice thing about this too is that you can see over here, there's these nice ages. So these governors, unfortunately, were not very long lived. They didn't live very long, but also they didn't live very long at their post. And so a lot of these people were kind of kicked, or maybe they got promoted, but a lot of them got kicked out and said, you're doing a terrible job managing these people. Plus, Israel was not very easy to manage because they hated the Romans. But you can kind of see that some of these give us an idea. So if we say like Jesus was alive, 26 BC to 34 AD, or some of these have a bigger range. But it's just nice to kind of get you an idea of that. So what else in history? There's actually lots and lots. I could go on and on about the history of the Bible based on archaeology. But one of the really interesting ones was the Cyrus cylinder in 539 BC. And Cyrus allows the Jews to return and to rebuild the temple. And it's actually this cylinder here, and you can kind of rotate it and you can read it, and it gives you a lot of information. But interesting, that cylinder also gave a lot of context for basically like free religion. It's one of the first instances in old history that basically they were saying, you can practice the religion that you want. And that's actually modeled now in our own Constitution, which is kind of neat that that's one of the first places. Now, we talked about the Dealt Town with David, the house of David being mentioned, and then there's the Babylonian Chronicles, Nebuchadnezzar's quest for Jerusalem, and it goes on, and I'll pull a few more in a little bit later. But you can kind of see that there's actually people that study the Bible for the historical context. So they may even not be Christians, but the Bible is such an accurate book that they feel like it's very reasonable to study it from a historical standpoint. Because of all these different people that are named, you can kind of get a context for different times, places, titles, institutions, even just how the geopolitical world was at that time. So the next part is this kind of textual or transmissional trustworthiness. So just to quickly highlight is what do I mean by things? Because I've heard different things about manuscripts, and we have a lot of different manuscripts from the New and Old Testament. And so originally, writings was on this tablet, and then we went to these kind of scrolls, and then we used this codex or books, which is kind of interesting, which now if you think about it, we actually scroll our books on tablets. So it's like, I don't know how we're kind of doing, are we going back in time? I don't know. But as we get these different manuscripts, so we don't have as many of these things because a lot of people back in the day didn't have a lot of writing ability, so it was more the scholars of the day were the ones that could usually write and read. And then as we get past this, then it was still books, but we went into the printing press, and that's really when things became very popular. Gutenberg Bible was the first book to be printed on the printing press. And interesting with a lot of these codexes, it was all handwritten, and a lot of the books, the very front and the very back weren't very well preserved because of wear and tear. If you set a book down, or if there's water damage, it's going to get the covers wet in the first little bit. So we have quite a bit of the middle sections of these kind of codexes, because these are big books. Imagine handwriting the entire Bible. It's going to be big text, like you don't write it on these small little fonts. So you might have several volumes to actually fit your Bible into. So how many manuscripts do we have? So there's over 25,000 ancient manuscripts of the New Testament alone. So there's about 8,500 Greek manuscripts, some as early as the 2nd century. There's about 10,000 Latin manuscripts, 9,000 other languages. And then there's the oldest fragments, which is called P52, which was written on papyrus. They got really creative. It was the 52nd of them. And it was written about 125 BC, which is CE, which is the AD, which is the Gospel of John. And then if you had the entire New Testament, there's this codex, which was written about 300 years later. So you may look at that and say, well, the earliest fragment that we have, let's say Jesus died at around 30 AD, and if that's about 100 years old, if you looked at it. However, probably some of John was actually one of the later Gospels that was written. And so we're probably looking at around 50 years after that his John book was actually discovered. So we're not too far off from where they were. So, and I also want to give you some comparison, because when people give you statistics, it's like when you listen to the news, you don't know what to trust, and you're like, how is this even important to my life? Because it's like, well, we have as soon as you click search on Google, you have about 1.6 million things on some random topic that means nothing. But then you're like, oh, there's only 25,000 ancient manuscripts. So that's why we can do a closest comparison. So if we did the earliest copy of the original, the New Testament, is about 50 to 150 years from the most original. And then we talked about these kind of 25,000. This table's a little bit old because we keep finding more and more manuscripts. But then the next down would be Homer. So if you've heard of the Iliad, Homer's Iliad is actually the next closest manuscript that we have. And there's about 1,800 of them. So again, we're not even close to that 25,000 that we had. And then we're 500 years away from when it was first originally written. So it's a long ways away. And then you can kind of see these other things here, like people that, we think about, in like Plato and Aristotle, like their writings from when they originally wrote it are 1,200 to 1,400 years away from when their original writings were. So if we're talking about like, well, can I trust what Aristotle wrote? Most people don't ask that question. But it was handed down over and over and over and over, and we don't have a good way to we don't have any way to compare it to a document that's 1,000 years old. And you can see the number of manuscripts just continues to dwindle over time. Even things like Caesar's Gallic Wars, 1,000 years, and then there's only 10 copies, which is very few. So the New Testament is one of the best preserved manuscripts of any book that we have from the ancient world. So how do we also know that? So the Dead Sea Scrolls, you've probably heard of. This contains all of the books of the Old Testament, except for Esther, oddly enough. But it has the entire book of Isaiah, all 66 chapters, and it's 95 to 95% identical to later Hebrew texts. And these later Hebrew texts are 1,000 years older. So if you're worried about that kind of transmission from year to year, there are also no theological variations. And I like to highlight here is that spelling we think of now, partly because of Webster's dictionary, but there's actually authors. So one of the first authors of one of the Bibles was John Wycliffe, you may have heard of, and he was actually known for spelling his last name differently. So there was no standardization of spelling. So if I said, like my name is Kyle, well, I'm going to do a K-Y-L-E, or I'm going to do a C-Y-L-E, or I'm going to do K-I-L-E, or I'm going to do K-I-L, or, like you can spell it however you want it because there was no standardization. So the vast majority of these like textual differences are usually spelling errors or spelling differences. Not even an error because it's kind of acceptable in that time frame and how you spell it because even if you think about in our world, if you've ever spelled something that's British and then compare it to our English, American English, there's some variations even within those two different things, even though we both speak English, but there's still variations in that. There are some things that are missing, but more and more we're finding, because this was not a super well preserved, it's the best preserved that we have, but there are things that, the smallest fragments could be just inches big that have partitions or they've been degraded over time. A lot of them were very well preserved. And how well preserved? There was actually one scroll, so Isaiah scroll, which was 24 feet long. So that was very well preserved. There's also almost 1,000 scrolls. And then you can kind of see, most of us think like, there was like this one cave where all of a sudden everything just like, that's where those jars were. However, it was kind of all along the Dead Sea. So they actually went and they found lots of different caves. And Qumran was the area where they looked at. And they used multiple different languages. So most of it was Hebrew, and then Aramaic, Greek, Nabatean. And then they also, they don't really know who had this, who actually owned these documents. They have some ideas based on the archaeology that they've been finding, but these were just basically kind of stored away for protection. They think probably due to some of the Roman invasions and things that they were trying to save their library because it's a very important text. So, how old are the Dead Sea Scrolls? This comes up in my mind and thinking like, okay, well, we say they're 1,000 or 2,000 years old. 2,077 years old, actually, would be the oldest. So one is you can do radiocarbon dating on some of these, and it aligns with this kind of Second Temple period. But they also do paleography, which is basically a handwriting analysis. So if you've ever seen, like I mentioned, some of those codexes, and they had like these beautiful, like flowing kind of fonts that they would draw, and it was almost like an artistry pattern versus like our handwriting now, which is like terrible print. And so it's kind of looking at like what's the commonality of that time frame. Even I sat in I don't want to say boring lecture on this once, and it was pretty fascinating. Just even looking at how in pen strokes, like where the T would start, or how you were trained on that. So there's like all these different variations in handwriting styles as things progressed over time. Then there's also the archaeological context, so looking kind of what's around these jars that were found at the Qumran site, and looking at the jars themselves and trying to identify what type of material they used, what type of ink that they used, even looking at some of the parchments and things that they found were made out of goats, and so trying to look at like genetic testing and how old things are. So they're going into this deep dive to try to figure out the more accurate like aging for these things. And then there's internal textual evidence. So I say limited use, but it is somewhat useful. So let's say if you had a story of Daniel, and then it said, and then the Romans came and they attacked Jerusalem, and it's like, well, the Romans were really a big thing in that time frame. Or if I said, like I said earlier, the Jamaicans attacked. Well, it's like, well, you just faked it. Like that doesn't have anything to do. But even there's some context, interestingly enough, around the names that are used. So there's ideas that, so a good example, like in the evidence in Luke or other Gospels where they name the different disciples, like they'll say, the son of Zebedee, or John the son of Zebedee, and James the son of Zebedee, because certain of those names that are being used are very common, or Matthew the tax collector, versus you say, oh, well, there's Bartholomew, and then they didn't say anything afterwards. Like, because his name's not very common, but Matthew's is very common. So even when we do that now, it's like if I said, hey, go see John, well, John who? Or go see Matt. Like, Matt who? I've got 6 in my phone. Like, so you kind of have to give them a context. So you can actually use some of those context clues to also age. Because even nowadays, like you can Google, as you're naming your kids, you can say, oh, what's the most common names? Because I don't want them to be the most common. But they're still the most common. Like if you said, oh, I know a Brittany. Well, she's probably like 30 to 40 years old now. Like, and because Brittany's not common now. It wasn't common in our parents' age, and now it's just probably my name. So those can all be textual helpful. So how accurate are these documents? So scholars estimate that it was 99.5% textual purity was preserved. And these variance differences, again, minutely in the manuscripts. Again, spelling errors, some word order changes, and then very few affect any meaning, and none are theologically affected. And even actually interestingly, like if you read the Bible now, you'll see like little like script notes or superscript, and it'll say like A, and then it'll say like, well, read the footnote, and the footnote will say like some versions include this, other versions don't include this. The writers of the Bible that were hand transcribing it did the same thing, where they would actually write in the margin and say, I'm transcribing these 2 different texts, and this text has the word A in it, and this one doesn't. So I'm going to write in the middle. You could include A if you wanted to, or if 50% of them had A, or something like that. So they actually were very descriptive in how they wrote. So it's very, very accurate. And then here's a good example, too, of how our English language has changed. So I can't even read the Old English, where, it's so hard. But then if you go to Middle English, which was 1100 to 1500, it says, "O Lord, gurneth me, and knowing shall defile me, the step of custard he sets me there." So, if I were to read that, you'd be like, what are you talking about? But then if you go to the King James, you kind of get more used to it, where it says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down." But then you can even see here, like lying down, has an E on it. But then if you go up here, it doesn't. So these are what we call textual variants. So if I were to say, how much of this is preserved compared to that? Technically, almost all of it is preserved. It's just I can't understand that because it's basically a different language. And so that's where it's important was you get these scholars that are reading it, they have to be familiar with not just the language that's being spoken, but also kind of the history of that language, because the language develops over time, but the actual text doesn't change, the meaning doesn't change. So I do like to highlight this, that there's a New Testament scholar, and he looked at a few different books, and so in Hinduism, there's a book that it was kind of their main book that I'm not even going to pronounce, but about 90% of them, it was about 90% accurate, and Homer's Iliad is about 95%, and the New Testament is 99.5%. And then again, that 0.5% does not affect a single doctrine in Christianity. So, and I mentioned some of the scribes, and as they did this kind of hand transcription, because again, the manuscripts are hand transcribed, they're not using a printing press. They are actually counting the letters of each line. They're marking the middle verse so they know exactly where they are, and then they're also kind of correcting errors explicitly. So if they messed up, two things would happen, is that they could either take the whole document and they could trash it, which if you just remember that there was like that 24-foot Isaiah, like if I got to 23 foot and I made one like mistake, I would be really sad. But what they could do is like they couldn't just make a line and cross it out, like they would have to make a context, and they would explicitly say like, I messed up, like this is my fault, I'm sorry, please don't throw this whole document away. Because like your heart would just break, I'm sure. But sometimes they would. It actually depended on which people were transcribing it. So they also did what's called what is read is what is written distinction. So there is a very like literal transcribing. It wasn't like the theory or thought behind it. Because these things are so sacred. The other aspect of this, is that, again, I mentioned how a lot of people didn't have the ability to describe. People didn't know how to write or to read. And one of the things that they would do in a lot of these things, just like you see in the New Testament, is that they would read it in groups. And this wasn't just in the synagogue. Like this would be people to get together and say, I've got a book, and I'm going to read it. And so why don't everybody come over to my house, or let's all go to the courtyard, or let's all go to the, those cool like Pantheon things or whatever, and say like, hey, let's read this all together. And so they would read that, and that was actually very true of like Paul. Like Paul would send these letters to these cities and these people, and then everybody would gather together and they would listen to Paul's like writings. And then if you think about that, like Paul was just a few years after Jesus, and so if Paul's writing something that's incorrect about Jesus, then the people in the crowd would be like, Paul's saying something wrong here. And then they would just like trash the document. So people, actually you see that later on. So that's a little ahead of myself, but part of this here is we're getting further, we're not getting further from the original text. What's actually going on is that we're getting closer to the original text. And you say that, you might be like scratching your head, being like, well, what does that mean? So when you looked at, the King James Version was written in 1611. I mean, that's a long time ago. And we still have the King James Version. And there's been some new additions because we get rid of some of those words that we don't understand anymore. But when they wrote the King James Version, there was actually 31 manuscripts that they used. And then in the earliest was the 11th century. Now, this was a couple years ago, but in 2024, there was over 5,000 like manuscripts for that new, for the same New Testament. And then we had all the way up to 100 AD. So with that, you're getting more and more information, so you can actually do more compare and contrasting. And the amazing thing that they're doing now with technology is that they're scanning all of these documents. And I'm sure in the next few years, they're going to run these massive AI things to kind of figure out like what are all the differences and similarities of them. But we're finding more and more things that we can compare to say, what does the text actually say, and how do we do that? So it's pretty incredible. So with that, there's also what we call the gospel differences. Like we said, that there's things that may look a little bit different. So here's a few of them. So one, genealogy of Christ. There's two different lines, one in Matthew, one in Luke. There's visitors at Jesus' birth. Okay, so I heard that some of you went to Hawaii. Is that right?
All three of us did. All three of us did.
Okay, so can you tell me a little bit? Well, actually, before we do that, could two of you go outside? And close the door. Where you can't hear what your sister is saying. You can take a snack, that's okay. All right. Yeah, so tell me a little bit about your trip.
What specifically do you want to know?
Yeah, well, I mean, when'd you get there? What'd you do? Who was with you?
Okay, so we went to Hawaii last year in the beginning of mid-January. It was a trek to get there because the most anxious part of our trip was flying to Hawaii, and we had a flight delayed, and it was all because of a small little like paperclip kind of a thing. It's kind of stressful. Our first big flight. Trying to get out of Indy and you couldn't.
Yeah, that's a bummer.
So we get to Hawaii. It's like 8 o'clock there, and we're like dead tired, super exhausted. But we meet with our family friends, and we're hanging out there. And like by 8 o'clock, we're like ready to conk out. Time change and all that stuff. So we are there, and we actually get up, and Kyle will think this is crazy. We got up at like 6 a.m.
Oh, yeah, that is crazy.
Just about every day we were there.
Yeah, it's like the normal time I get up. Yeah.
Pretty crazy for us because normally we sleep until like 10.
Yeah, I know,
or
it's
start our
great.
day like that around that time. But in Hawaii, things are different. We go to bed early, wake up early. We did sunrise. Saw the sunrise every morning. Walked to every place we could. Got to explore the island. We went snorkeling. We only saw one sea turtle. We got to go surfing. I did get up. My sisters did not. But it was barely anything. But we saw a lot of sea urchins and a lot of nature, and got to go on some hikes and stuff like that. So it was really fun.
Any events on the way back? Like, you said it was hard on the flights getting there, but anything?
Yeah, just getting there was pretty, it was fine. Everything was fine, but it was kind of inconvenient. Getting home was pretty fine. We had a red-eye flight back home, so we were exhausted when we got home.
All right.
It was overall super fun.
Good. All right. We're going to see if we can get one of your sisters to come back. Just turn it off. It's in there. Yeah. Sounds good. Now, hopefully you guys are remembering some of the details that she said to you. Actually, you can, yeah. All right. Okay, Tori, you're up next. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, so we heard a little bit about Hawaii. I'd like to hear your story. How was the Hawaii trip? Tell me a little bit about it. Yeah.
Just a little rundown.
Yeah, hit the little thing there. Yeah. Just a little rundown. Yeah.
It was probably the best trip of my life.
Okay. Yeah. Great.
It was really nice, super warm. I think it was a perfect blend of beach and mountains. So if you're looking for the perfect place to go, you've got such a variety of stuff. Warm, beach, and then you can go hiking in the mountains.
Yeah.
We got to shop, which was probably the best thing. We got to walk to shopping. That was really nice. So it turned out to be kind of like a cheap trip, which was good because we're poor. And yeah, we got really good food. We got really good coffee and fun treats and stuff, which was really fun. Yeah.
That's great. Anything eventful at the end of the trip?
At the end of the trip?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Okay. What was your favorite part?
My favorite part was probably the shopping and the snorkeling.
All right.
I would say I really like the snorkeling.
I like it. Thank you. All right. We'll see if your next sister can come in. Thank you so much. That was a great explanation of your Hawaii trip. I can't wait to go there. I don't know if I'll do as much shopping as you, but it sounds like a lot of fun. I look at this picture and I'm like, that would be amazing. I think to go there. But was the water as blue as that?
Yes.
It was?
Yeah.
Man, that's great. Wonderful.
Not where we went.
We lost somebody. That's okay.
Do I need to grab her?
Well, I thought Viv was grabbed her and she disappeared. Oh, there we go. Okay, come on. We got one more. So one of the things with the gospel writers was that they were also writing to different people groups. So Matthew was a Levi and a tax collector. Come on up. We got one more thing. So Vienna, I heard you went to Hawaii, but I'm going to ask you a little bit different than your sisters. Okay, so part of it is like your audience. So I want to, you're in marketing, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so I want you to market Hawaii a little bit. Just give me a little spiel as to why Hawaii is going to be awesome.
Okay. Hawaii is the best state you'll ever go to because the people there are so nice, so friendly, not in a rush. The food there is phenomenal. You get the best of both worlds, mountains and beach.
Yeah.
The prices are not that great, but it's totally worth it.
So that's good. Yeah, a little positive and negative. It's
Yeah.
like it's worth coming, but it's expensive.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. And I will ask, what was your favorite part of the trip?
My recent one, or
Any one of them. Yeah. What's your favorite part of Hawaii?
I'm not a morning person, so because of the time difference, I am a morning person there.
Oh,
And so I was awake enough to go to the sunrises on the beach every morning.
Oh, that's great.
And I can't do that here. So
Yeah, that's great. Awesome.
that was my favorite part.
Cool. You just hit that off. Thank you so much. That was perfect. You guys did an amazing job. Thank you. Round of applause for them. Thank you, insights. So, you might have seen my point, but as we were looking at some of these things here, as these kind of like apparent differences of the Gospels, as we're looking at things, you can tell from their stories that they had different emphases. Yeah. So, what actually leads to what's called internal coherence without forced harmonization. So I told them, please don't talk about what you're going to say up front to each other, because I want them to give them some information. So they did talk about how good the food is. They talked about how they woke up early. However, one said specifically, I woke up at 6 a.m. One just said, I woke up early. Which one's right? They're both right. You know, it's this kind of harmonization. And actually in the world of law and study of law, that is somebody who has a harmonized story where everything is the exact same detail, it's a lie. Because they've gotten together and said that this is all a lie. And that's actually what we see in the four Gospels, which is actually amazing that there's four of them that have this internal coherence without forced harmonization. Because each one of them has a different emphasis. They also have different people groups that they're writing to. So, like I mentioned, so Matthew is writing to the Israelites, the Hebrews. Mark and Luke are more for the like Gentile groups, and then John is kind of this unique kind of outlier that's just like, I'm telling you this story. It's awesome. Like he's got a full different perspective, and it's also written at a different time. And so I think it's really neat if you actually read the four different Gospels, these different variations. And there's actually a neat book that they actually put them all four together, so you have this like one long history of the Gospels by putting all the stories on top of each other. So pretty neat. So great example of Hawaii and how it actually fits the four Gospels. Even though there's three of you needed one more sister to have four Gospels, but it worked. So that also leads me to my next point. We talked about this kind of non-canonical Gospels. So you might have heard of like the Gospel of Philip or Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Thomas, things that aren't included in our Bible nowadays. And really part of that is that this harmonization is that there's not this internal coherence. And they're also, much later, we've talked about like over here, the Synoptic Gospels are written like in the 40s, so only like 10 years after Jesus' death. And then Acts is just a couple of years after that. So, but these other ones that are kind of later, you can kind of tell even in some of Paul's writings, he's actually suggesting, hey, don't get away from the gospel message. Like, don't listen to these other people that are trying to lead you astray. So people are already trying to, like, make their way away from Christ. Like, they were trying to say different things. And this happened for centuries afterwards where people were trying to write these things. So I mentioned earlier how even your names that you're using can actually indicate when something was written. And this is actually true in some of these non-canonical Gospels, is that they're using names that were not popular in the time of Jesus. They were not used at that time. And so it didn't have any help in saying that this was actually written like that. And some of these things are found in really odd spots, and they're not really used in any of the churches early on. So don't have much support, so that's why they're not typically included. Plus some of them don't fit that harmonization of the Jesus story. They say things like, oh, when Jesus was a kid, he did all these miracles for himself. Well, we never see Jesus doing anything for himself during the other 4 Gospels. So it's, again, it doesn't quite mesh up. And so that's why they were excluded from the canon. But you can kind of guess, even nowadays, people are marketing and making a lot of money on Christianity because they're tweaking things and saying, oh, well, if you donate $10,000, then God is going to do this for you, or whatever. And unfortunately, that's probably some of what's happening here. If you can follow my gospel, or you can follow my Christianity, then you're going to come to my sect, and then I'm going to make some money off of this. So you have to be a little careful about that. So I mentioned here, but they were written late, these non-canonical Gospels. They weren't written by eyewitnesses, so those Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were either eyewitnesses or they were historically accurate. So like we mentioned, Luke, he was, I would say, a historian. He was saying, I want to do a biography of Jesus. And I want to talk to as many people as I can. I want to get as much information versus some of these other people that were just like writing a story. So even we could do that now. If I said, hey, I want you to write a story about Jesus that has nothing to do about Jesus, you could easily just put it on a piece of paper. So you have to be, again, taking that, and also the theological consistency. And then I mentioned earlier too how that is a very verbal society, so not everybody could read or write. So memory was huge. People were memorizing vast amounts of information. They could memorize the first 5 books of the Bible by the time they were a teenager. So if you were saying things, even with those first few years, people would know if you're saying something inaccurately. So the next piece, sorry I'm going a little long tonight, but hopefully it's good. Can we trust that the Bible is divine? Now this is a harder question. We looked at some of the historical evidence as well as archaeology and texts. So how do we know that it's real? And I think as we hint at like the supernatural, I think everybody's looking for that. But does the Bible claim to be divine? Yes, but so does these other books. There's the Quran, the Book of Mormon. But then we looked at historical context. The Bible actually has the best historical context. Some for the Quran, less for the Book of Mormon. But then we talked about manuscripts as well. But this middle section here, the prophecies. So the Bible has a lot of prophecies. And some of these other ones have very minimal prophecies. Even to the point that we can, well, I'll get to that. So, sorry. But what are some of the prophecies in the Bible? So I want to show that there's a supernatural component to the Bible. So that no human can predict. So Isaiah 7, which we saw earlier, was in a part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which happened hundreds of years before Jesus, predicted a virgin birth. Psalms 22 had a suffering servant. Daniel 2 looks at Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and then a broken empire. Micah 5:2 said that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. Isaiah 52 said that there would be he would be pierced for our transgressions and our iniquities. So these are just a few of them. So are there any clear prophecies in the Bible that came true? I think some of those that I mentioned, but I wanted to highlight just a few with Daniel real quick. Because I think Daniel is this book that a lot of people aren't sure about. But if you just take some time to read it, it's actually a really fun book to look through and to examine in more detail. But first, I want to clarify, when is this written? Because this was a question I had. And traditional scholars actually date it to around 500 to 540 BC. And some skeptics say it's probably much earlier than that, like 165 BC. But there's not really evidence for that. Most of the evidence is actually much earlier. And it's actually found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And even that manuscript itself is dated between 200 and 125, which I doubt that it was written at the time and then stored there at the same time, because it's actually referenced by other books. So Ezra actually mentions Daniel as well. So I think the best traditional scholar date is the most accurate and has the most evidence behind it. It's also consistent with the time of Babylon and Medo-Persia. There's also this language evidence. So again, we don't think a lot about our language nowadays in this way, but Daniel used Aramaic from the 6th century, from not that 2nd century. So just like I mentioned before, like if I said something like, take off your shoethith as you walk into the door, you'd be like, okay, you're not from this age. And it's kind of that same thing. There's a different textual context with the 6th century versus the 2nd century Aramaic. Then there's also the knowledge of Babylon and Persian courts are very accurate. So the Belteshazzar, which I'll talk about in a minute, Darius, the Mede, Babylonian administrative titles, Persian legal structure. All these details were unknown in the 2nd century, but were validated later by archaeology. And again, 2nd century Jewish author could not have known about these details to the court. It was a very detailed book if you look at it. So I mentioned Belteshazzar. So in Daniel, it says that Belteshazzar was having this big party, and then Babylon got overthrown. And however, if you look at text, so Nabonidus was actually the last king of Babylon. So then, it's like, the Bible's wrong. There's no mention of Belteshazzar. And however, they found this Nabonidus cylinder, and in there it says that Belshazzar, Nabonidus' son, was present. And so, actually during this time, it's called Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nabonidus was this ruler, but he was trying to fight off all these people all the time. And so he was actually out fighting battles. And so who's in charge when the king's away? The prince. And so he is actually the king when the king is away. So Belteshazzar was the second in command, which is actually, if you study in Daniel, when he interprets the handwriting on the wall, he says, "You will be the third in the kingdom." Because he was the second. He's not giving up his spot. He's going to give him the third. So he's actually right next to Belshazzar for that. But then it's overthrown by Medo-Persia. And then also Ezekiel mentions Daniel. I'm going to skip that. But then Nebuchadnezzar then has this vision. And this is in Daniel 2. And you can see these different parts. There's this head of gold, the chest and silver of arms, the belly of bronze. And then each one of these represents different kingdoms throughout there. And then it also kind of gives you an idea. I like to look at this a little bit. Again, we're trying to look at the historical context of this. So remember, it was around 500 BC that this vision was taking place. And these are the different population variations here. So Babylon had about 3 to 5 million people. Babylon City was about 300,000. And then there's the Median Persian Empire, about 1 to 2 million people, so they're pretty big. Persia's a little smaller. And then Greece is still pretty big, but they're kind of fragmented all over the place. And then Rome was this really tiny just city at that time. And so for him to kind of predict this laying out is pretty incredible. That's saying like these people are going to take over succession of Babylon. And then in Daniel 7, he goes on with another vision that happens and gives more detail where there's a lion with wings, which is actually the Babylonian symbol. Sorry, that picture didn't turn out very well. It looks good on here, but not there. But then, so the Babylon has these different kind of things, but it actually gives you more description. So like the bear in Daniel 7 actually is raising on one side because Medo-Persia was actually always lopsided. One Medes or the Persians were stronger than the other group, even though they were working together. And then also there's the Greek Empire, which had divided into 4 kingdoms. It was a 4-legged animal on all 4 legs. And then there's the terrifying beast of iron, which Rome was known for using iron weapons in their military. Then the Son of Man comes after that. Then real quick, there's also Daniel 8, which again goes into even more detail. And this is actually really incredible that he actually names the groups. So some of them earlier on, he just suggests like these different kingdoms are going to be in succession. However, here in this one, he actually says that the ram with 2 horns is Medo-Persia. The goat of the west is Greece. The large horn is the he doesn't name Alexander the Great, but he says the first king is this, is great and powerful, and the 4 after him are not as powerful, which is actually true. They actually divided into 4 kingdoms after Alexander Great's death. That was pretty sudden. They weren't expecting him to die, and ended up breaking up the kingdom. So really, again, there's kind of 3 chapters that are looking at this secession after Babylon, which I think continues to fulfill prophecy, which he did not able to predict. I don't think we'd be able to predict that, that far ahead. This is several hundred years of history. However, I think one of the biggest ones for me was actually what's called the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel 9. And this is written during Babylonian exile. Daniel prays to Israel, and he says, what if I read this to you? If I read this to you, what would you be thinking? I want you to be thinking about this in the audience. So, for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Any ideas? What comes to mind? So hopefully it's the Messiah is coming. He's going to make us all better. First, before we get into this, there's this context of a day for a year in prophecy. So Numbers 14:34, Ezekiel 4:6. And even the idea, if you look at Jesus' life mirrors a lot of things that happen in the Old Testament. And Jesus has 40 days in the wilderness, which is very similar to Israel having 40 years in the wilderness. Think about as you read the Bible that there's a lot of these contextual variations that are actually very similar, they overlap. So for a day for a year is important in this context. So the starting point in Daniel 9:25, it says, from going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. So there's actually 3 decrees. So we mentioned Cyrus' cylinder. So that was permission to return to Jerusalem. Darius then reaffirms that. And then Artaxerxes in 457 BC gives them full political, judicial, and religious autonomy. So most scholars would say that this is really when the decree happened, because this is not just a decree for the temple and like returning to it, but it's actually to say you can now be your own political group. You can restart your political group. So then with this, you get this division of weeks. So at the beginning of the week it says rebuilding Jerusalem. So Nehemiah verifies that. And then you have 7 weeks and 62 weeks is what you would read until the Messiah appears. So how does this work? So we're going to do 69 weeks. We're going to add that up nicely. So if you want to use your calculators, you can. So you do 457 plus 383. Sorry, that didn't come out as well either. 483, and then you get 20. Actually, you're going to get 26 on your calculator, but you have to remember not to do 0 because it went from 1 BCE to 180. There's no year 0, as much fun as it would be. But yeah, so 27. So what happened in 27 AD? It's around the time that Jesus was baptized. And there's always a little bit of plus minus because they think that they messed up on the 0 date when Jesus was born, slightly. And partly that's because of all those things that we mentioned earlier for all the different people like Pilate and Herod and Ananias and all those people that we can kind of date things a little bit more accurately now. Because actually, again, as we're moving forward and we're getting more information through archaeology, we're getting a better sense of where things actually took place. So Jesus was born in 27 AD. And then in Daniel 9:26 and 27, it talks about, in the middle of the last week, there will be the ending of sacrifice. Now, if you think about the sacrificial system, they were killing lambs, right? And the lamb represents the Lamb of God, or Jesus. And if you add 3.5 years to 27 AD, you get 31 AD, which is the ending of sacrifice because the veil of the temple was torn. It was a symbol of you no longer need to kill animals because the ultimate sacrifice has been made. So it was this kind of hard stop of this progression there. So then at the end of the 70 weeks, it's another 3.5 years, and this happens, historically context is around the stoning of Stephen. And this is, again, the gospel then turns not just to the Jews, but then to all of the Gentiles, or everyone in the world. So here's kind of a bigger graph of it. So if you start at the 457 BC, it's the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Then you have 69 weeks, which then Jesus is baptized. 3.5 years, that middle of the week in Daniel is AD 31. Jesus is crucified, the end of the sacrificial system. And then Stephen is stoned, which then, because it talks about in Daniel 9. So your homework is to read Daniel 9 and see if you can draw this graph. But it's really kind of gives you a full context of what happens there in that 70-week prophecy. So with the 70-week prophecy, these are messianic prophecy. It's really tied, I believe, to Jesus, and the timeline is perfect for what we believe. And I don't think that happened by chance. And I think also here, the Messianic prophecies all throughout things. So I mentioned earlier, some of the things like in Psalms and Isaiah and Micah that mention different things about the Messiah. There's about 300 different specific details around the Messiah, the place of his birth, the tribe, the manner of his death, time of appearance, all these things come together. So again, the chances, there's actually a book that tries to predict even just 10 of these things for Jesus himself to be in the right time, the right place, the right birth, the right order of everything is astronomically low as a chance. So I think as we have gone through things, is it historically trustworthy? I think it's been consistently historically trustworthy based on archaeological evidence. Is it textually transmission trustworthy? Again, I think it is. It's been consistent, even with the Dead Sea Scrolls probably being the biggest impact on the Christian world for evidence around that textual consistency. The canon itself has been reliant, and I think the prophecies like them are like none other. It's been said that even the Bible has about, I think it's 20 to 30% of it has some way of prophecy related to it, and no other holy book comes close to that, and no other book predicts things like the Bible does. Nothing can predict the falling of kingdoms so perfectly, or predict the Messiah to come just like the Bible does. So I think it is the holy word of God that is given to us through multiple different authors over many years, but it's been consistent as well. So with that, I'll open it to the floor if there's any questions or thoughts.
I've thought about it, as I've read the Bible over the years, high spiritual content, extremely high spiritual content, something that you just don't see written anywhere else. And those same writers turn around and say, I'm not lying when I'm writing this. There's no way somebody with that amount of spiritual knowledge and depth could turn around and lie.
Yeah. One thing too I also didn't talk about, but is actually the honesty of the authors. So if you were trying to fake something about a new religion, you wouldn't be putting things in there as like, I didn't understand what Jesus was saying at the time, or a woman beat me to the tomb, and then my friend Peter, he's faster than me and ran there quicker, or I did this thing and Jesus called me the devil. So there's lots of these kind of things in the author. Even if you look at David, this famous king, he had this terrible thing with Bathsheba, and then he killed Uriah, and it's like, why would you if you were trying to fake it, why would you say that this most important guy is terrible? Or even Abraham, which is the main guy for Israel, he had multiple issues as well. He lied to people. He slept with people he probably shouldn't have. He kicked his family out and said, "No, Ishmael, I can't have you after all. You got to leave." I mean, all these things are like not good. And even if you think about Abraham and himself, a lot of the writings in that time period are around kings and rulers and people that want to say that I'm God, I'm this big man and you need to worship me like the pharaohs. But Abraham is this like really humble guy, and he's never like, look at me, how great I am. If anything, he's kind of a coward and saying like, hey, tell him you're my sister because I don't want to get thrown in jail or killed, So it's really interesting, those kind of things also. It doesn't, obviously say that the Bible is holy because of it, but to me, it just supports the evidence again that the authors are being honest. Yeah.
I had somebody tell me that like the prophecy or the just Daniel chapter 9 wasn't relevant anymore. And for context, this person has read like the Bible all the way through, and is super intimidating when I talk to him. But it's like, where did you get that from? Where did you get that teaching from? Why?
Yeah. Like, where did they get that teaching from? Like, it's not relevant?
Yeah.
So what I've heard a lot of is Daniel and Revelation are, one, they're not relevant, and because a lot of people don't understand them, and we can't understand them. And so a lot of people think that they're hidden books. And actually, if you read the first chapter of Revelation, it basically says, read this and you will understand. And so but the Bible as a whole, and the more I read of it, you have to study it. Like, you can't just read it. Like, you got to take your cross-references and take this and that. But I think that more people feel like it's this obscure thing with lots of things that we don't understand, so we should just wait until Jesus tells us when it is. But I think that we can understand it. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of work. And I think there's some really smart people to do that. And, is this the only interpretation of Daniel 9? No. Do I think it's the most logical? Yes. And I think that's part of it. People think that a lot of these things are in the future. They say well, Daniel 9 or the Messiah is not come yet, or it's going to be in the millennia. A lot of people think a lot of these things are going to happen in the in heaven or at the new earth, and say these are all things that are going to happen eventually. But I'm like, well, then why do we use all these mythical creatures lions with wings and iron teeth and dragons, and it's because they're metaphorical, and if you study the rest of the Bible, you can kind of tease out what do those things mean. But again, you have to study it. So I'd say it's still relevant, because for me, that prophecy in itself was very impactful in my own personal walk, because I could see this couldn't have happened by chance. It's so perfectly designed, and are you going to get some plus minus? And I'm okay with that. So in my undergrad, I took physics, and if you ever took physics, your physics professors, they make you do an equation, and you solve a problem, and you do the chemistry lab, and you say, okay, I'm going to throw this ball, and the arc has this arc, and then it's going to land here, plus or minus 6 inches, because that's my area of inaccuracy from my measurement. And it's the same thing with this. Are the dates exactly perfect? No, but they're if you go off of a lot of these, they are. But at the same time, it's who came up with the AD? It was this monk, it was 1100 AD or something, and then he tried to map it all out, and then he missed a few dates. But now that we have these things like inscriptions and dating, and you can get more and more accurate. And so if I say 0 is when Jesus, or 1 BC was when Jesus was born, it's probably offset. And so if you go with those offsets, plus or minus 5, it's still if I'm within 5 years of the Messiah, that's pretty good. So I think if you go off the dates that we have now with more and more precision, it's right on. Anything else? Yeah?
Yeah, I have a question on just the internal consistency part of this. And I haven't studied a lot of this super in depth, but I've read a little bit of kind of both sides of this discussion, and in my experience at least, it just seems the other side that says the Bible's not necessarily completely internally consistent, they do have some good points. For example, the prophecies about Jesus, I do agree if those are all prophecies specifically about Jesus, then it's very unlikely that someone would just fully fulfill all those perfectly. But I think, for example, Jews, they would look at Christians and say no, those aren't prophecies about Jesus, and you're taking them out of context and you're misapplying them. And I always grew up thinking that was kind of ridiculous, but then once I actually looked really closely at some of them, I was oh yeah, this prophecy in Zechariah is, if you just read it as it is, it's not clearly referring to someone far in the distant future. It's just talking about a king that's going to appear in the next generation or so and save Israel. And so yeah, why does Matthew quote that as referring to Jesus? And I think there are some prophecies that are clearly messianic, but a lot of them, I don't know, I can see the other side that kind of has a point. Yeah, it is remarkable if they are prophecies, but it's kind of unclear to me that they are actually prophecies about Jesus versus just things that are rooted in the past, and we're just kind of picking and choosing. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think whenever I quoted the 300 Messianic prophecies, I agree that there are ones that I've written, and even ones where Matthew quotes and says, Jesus is fulfilling this prophecy, that are kind of loosely associated with, a king of olden days or whatever. However, the more I've also studied the Bible, I also see that the Old Testament is kind of a preamble to the New Testament, and that a lot of things that were happening in the Old Testament were also, they're prophecies in themselves as they're predicting something that's going to happen, and it's kind of this fulfillment of it. So another example would be, before Jesus had those 40 days in the wilderness, the Israelites are kind of this mirror of Jesus in the sense that they had to be baptized in a way through the Red Sea, and then they had 40 years in the wilderness. So is it a pure prophecy? No, I don't think that it's okay, well, Jesus had to be baptized before he had the 40 days in the wilderness. But I think it does, again, kind of mirror that a little bit. And so I think there's a lot of that. And I think as we look at how the gospel writers were interpreting a lot of those Old Testament writings to kind of come along, everybody that was in that time frame was waiting for the Messiah. Like everything that they read in the Old Testament was supposed to be pointing them to the Messiah. Even if it's like about this next king or this holy baby that's going to be born, they were all looking at that as like, this is an example of what the Messiah is supposed to be like. And granted, did they get everything right? No. But I do see your point that there are some that we are kind of that kind of points to that. Even just like if you said like, well, Joseph was betrayed for silver and Jesus was betrayed by silver, like that's true, but there are different amounts, and so then it's like, well, that doesn't match up 100%, but it's still, again, it's a reflection of, it's not the exact same thing. So I think that's one of the things I would say with that.
That's a really good question. I just add to that. We can try to prove certain things, but for me, as an example, I was going through the Chicago Institute of Arts one time, and all the side wings and looking at the beautiful pictures, and then I came across this Renoir in the center of the two women on the patio, and I was floored. It was just the most beautiful, amazing piece of work I've ever seen. And so I think people in our society now don't always need proof 100%. It's the experience of it. And the same thing happened to me with the gospel and with Jesus. I can read around it and proofs, but when I put all the puzzle pieces together, I'm just filled with this beautiful thing that I don't need 100% proof of. And I guess that's what I would suggest maybe for some of our Jewish friends or skeptics is the experience of it. It's just overwhelmingly beautiful.
Yeah.
And God does not remove every shred of possible doubt. There's always that small possibility that, so we have to exercise faith. But the alternate explanations, that are, you have to have more faith to believe those, because there's more questions in how they came about that. But the prophecies are pretty accurate, and we can't even predict tomorrow.
Yeah.
How can they predict 100 years from now? So yeah, there's just so much evidence, I think.
Yeah.
Talk about that. I think a lot of that mirroring comes to helping us understand Bible better, with prophecies pointing to kind of how the lambs, that whole process. Not that everyone's going to be saved through Jesus anyway, but that kind of gives us a better picture of the slaughtering of the lambs. Things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think when you study the sanctuary as a whole, you can see Jesus all throughout that. As the lamb, but he's also the high priest. And even if you look at each individual item in there, he is represented by those, and it's just incredible. How it's that's just if you just studied the sanctuary, you could get the whole gospel out of it. He's there to wash your sins. He's there to take your sins. He's the priest to move it into the most holy place before God, to be your sanctuary, to be your sacrifice. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I think you're right. Great. All right. Well, I think that's great. Let me do a plug for next time. So again, I guess a little bit more on is there evidence for Jesus? So we just kind of talked about the Bible some tonight. We talked a little bit about the Gospels because that's where a lot of people ask, why are there differences between them? But this is also going to look more specifically at some of the evidence specifically around Jesus. And then we'll talk again on the 20th about the problem of evil, trust science. We'll talk some more about death and truth. So hopefully you guys can make it, and if you find some more people to come, please bring them, because we have more food than